So I've been working with developers probably every day for the last 8 years. And developers like our CTO, Phil, who codes our clients' design systems. Let's meet Phil.
Doing this might be.
Thanks, Phil. And I've released some videos covering developer handoff in the past, but nothing that goes super in depth in things like error states, edge cases, file structure, and even annotations as well. So what this video is meant to be the one-stop shop for everything relating to design to developer handoff. We're going to cover the most complex pieces to start, which are annotations, before we look at file setup, error states, and a lot more. Let's go. And if you support what the team and I are doing at UI Collective, be sure to check out the link below for our website where we're building the future of design education. We recently launched our academy with a ton of great courses. We also recently just launched our case study builder as well, and interview prep, and a lot more on the way. Everyone who supports now gets lifetime access to everything that's coming up as well, so be sure to check that out. So before we get into the heart of the action, let's just set scene set, go through some basic table stake stuff before we actually get into the more fun stuff of this tutorial, okay? Right away. Developers do not think like designers, and designers do not think like developers. If you think that your developer understands you, you are incredibly wrong. What I mean by that is what makes sense to us does not make sense to them. So, prime example, let's say you have a button at the top of a landing page that says Browse FAQ, and there's an FAQ at the bottom of the page. A designer would look at that design and say, okay, that Browse FAQ button would take you to the FAQ section. But a developer would look at the page and say, okay, where's the FAQ page? I see the FAQ section, but where's the FAQ page? So prime example as to a designer being able to interpret that as, okay, and that button takes you to the FAQ section. Developer's not going to think like that. Also, too, don't just assume that developers know the interactions. This is something I have seen more times than you can count working with developers, is a tooltip. Unless the specific interaction of that tooltip is called out in the designs, what's going to happen is the developer might just code in the tooltip icon, thinking that it just happens to go with the label, not that there's an actual interaction that is supposed to go with that tooltip. So small interactions that make sense to us as designers, lay it out for them, make their lives easy. Also, too, do not just assume that they know how to work a prototype. I used to do this when I first got started in design many years ago. And even now, when I still work with junior designers, I see it all the time, is they just send the development team a prototype link. Okay, that's great, but a prototype is never just a happy path flow. It's never just a one flow that you go through. Oftentimes there's interactions in that prototype. There's sub pages that need to be viewed. So if you just hand a developer a prototype and say, this is what it should look like, and this is how it should work, chances are they're going to miss pages and miss interactions as part of that prototype. Moving on. This is a two-way street. So both designers and developers have a role to play in the design and ultimately what this handoff process should look like. One thing I've heard a lot of in the past is, oh, it's a developer's fault. Nothing is ever a developer's fault, and nothing is ever a designer's fault. If it's a developer's fault, it's probably because the designer didn't give them the necessary tools and information in order for them to do their job properly. And if it's a designer's fault, the developer did not ask the right clarifying questions. Okay, so never point blame on a developer because they're just doing their job the way that they know how. Developing, it's not their fault that something was coded wrong because it was laid out in an improper way on an actual Figma file and certain interactions and use cases were not properly communicated to them. Okay, so ultimately handoff is not the job of just a designer and is not just the job of a developer, but it's working together through this process. So once we get into a lot of the annotations a little bit later on, is you're going to see what I mean, how the developer will be able to weigh in a little bit more on some of the more complex annotations that a designer would be able to properly understand. Now, a bulk of the first part of this video is going to be just on annotations. Now, what takes a designer from a junior level to a senior level is being able to look at designs through an accessibility lens. I'm not just talking about color contrast, because that's like table stakes when it comes to accessibility. I'm talking about the finer details that actually help developers build out the most accessible product possible. As an example, like when I used to design at the Royal Bank of Canada and like their wealth department, we actually had to sign off on designs that they were 100% accessible. Okay, that's how important it is to a lot of these organizations now. And if you're just getting started in design, you're looking for a new job, mastering this topic, you basically already have one foot in the door with the design team. So one thing we're going to look at a lot to start is actually the annotations, and not just like helping developers like understand where certain things go or what certain interactions are, but actually being able to like speak the developer's language in terms of the different tags that are actually going to go into their code in order to build the most accessible product possible. This is a little bit more of an advanced topic, but I promise you, you master this. Again, you basically have one foot in the door at any organization. Okay, so with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so one thing I want to do is address Figma's current annotation system because it is incredibly limiting, and I would actually suggest that you don't use it at all. And when they came out with this, I was actually super disappointed. I was like, really? Like, this is all you guys got? So, of course, you can add annotations inside Figma here, where if I was to click this, I'd be able to assign a category for it, whether it's a development annotation, an interaction annotation, accessibility annotation, content annotation. And if we were to hit development annotation, as designers, it's like we're kind of just left to our own devices in order to populate this out. Sure, you can work with developers in order to add details here, but sometimes details are lost in the weeds. The structure for which these annotations are formatted is just not right. And sure, I can add properties like as a component of height, the width, direction, alignment, gap, padding. But one thing I want to cover too is even with accessibility, it's still the same things, right? Like padding, gap, alignment, direction. If I was to click into, sorry, I think the UI of this is super weird too. But if I was to hit this form field as an example, and I was to apply an accessibility annotation, and I try to add a property, I see height, width, corner radius, direction, alignment, gap, padding, fill stroke, stroke width, but nothing about how a screen reader might interpret this. Nothing about accessibility labels, because that's a lot of what goes into development, is that kind of thing. Oftentimes, developers can use dev mode in order to inspect the actual component itself. So for me, I would absolutely not suggest using Figma's out-of-the-box annotations when working with your developers. Too much can go wrong in terms of information not being properly displayed or included inside of these annotations. And plus, like half of the elements that are in here are completely useless and don't really matter to developers. But when it comes to our annotations, we actually need to go another level down, get into the technical weeds around helping our developers understand our designs. So for that, I actually use a Figma library that has really in-depth annotations that when working with developers, they love, I love, and it's just great to use. So let's look at that next. Now for this, I use the Web Accessibility Annotation Kit by CVS Health. And they are not paying me to do this at all. I'm doing this because this is hands down the best kit that you can possibly use when it comes to working with your developers and like labeling certain elements for accessibility, interactions, and all that fun stuff. It goes down like a 50x in terms of complexity and the details that developers are hoping to see when compared against Figma's annotations that we just looked at. Okay. Again, I'm sure Figma is eventually going to get there with their annotations in terms of a lot of the elements that are included in this kit, but they're just not there yet. Okay. So what this kit does, it goes in depth on like input annotations, tab order annotations, reading order annotations, the small things that designers aren't thinking about, and also the small things that developers might not be thinking about when it comes to their design. Okay, so it unlocks a lot of great dialogue between designers and developers that oftentimes a lot of both groups are not even thinking about including in the annotations. So again, this is a free kit. I'm going to put a link for it below. It's by CVS Health. Again, they're not paying me to publish or promote this kit by any means. It's totally free on Figma community. Let's go ahead and unlock and look a little bit in depth on each of the different types of annotations included inside this accessibility kit. So let's start off with link annotations and button annotations. Because when I said earlier that designers and developers don't think the same, this is a prime example, okay, of that. So I'm going to pull in two components from our design system. Okay, so a button component and then a link component. Again, this design system is a part of our academy. I'll put a link for that both down below, both the design system as itself and also the academy. Okay, so what I have here are just a basic button component and a basic link component. Okay, so let's just change this to like learn more just for consistency purposes. Okay, so let me condense this down. Sorry, now I'm getting picky and center these. Sorry, I'm a nerd. Okay, so if this says learn more, and it was to take me to a different page. A designer is going to look at this and say, that's a button component. But if it takes me to a different page, a developer is going to say, no, that's a link. Weird, right? It's the way developers think. Even with this link component, if this was to say something like download, okay, and maybe we hid the icon left and change this to a download button, to a download, even though it's a link component, a developer is going to look at this now and say, no, that's a button. That is no longer a link. You're using the link component, but it's actually a button, and vice versa. And this is like table stake stuff that drives developers like a crazy, is when designers don't necessarily think the same. So they keep referring to it as a button, as a button, as a button. But in a developer's mind, because it's actually taking the user to a different page, it's actually a link in their eyes. Okay. So even things like buttons need specific annotations to help developers understand what this button, what this link is doing, so they'll be able to actually program that button or that link accordingly. Now, confusing, right? Have no fear. The Web Accessibility Annotation Kit is here. So let's go through. I came up with that on the spot, by the way. So let's go through and let's look at the button annotations and the link annotations and what's included in those annotations that's going to make your developers' lives easier. Okay, so here I am just within the Web Accessibility Annotation Kit on the left. So basically what I did is I just copied the file that was from Figma's community, published it within my own workspace, and now I just consume it as if it was like a regular design system, because that's kind of what it is in a nutshell. So when it comes to button versus links, is a big part of developer handoff, and it's a big mistake that designers make. And this is what takes a junior designer, in my eyes at least, to a senior designer, is being able to call out a lot of these like specific things, because dev handoff is not just about like making sure developers know how the designs work. It's also making sure that what's developed is also accessible. So calling out a button versus a link is a small part of it, but there's a lot that goes into a lot of these elements that your developers might not be thinking about, or that they might not know what to include. Maybe they're thinking about it and then they're just taking a rough guess as to what it is. What those elements are, we're going to unlock those one by one. So if you're confused now, stay with me. Okay. So here I am just within the sample dashboard. It's not the best dashboard in the world, but it's a start. So I'm going to start off with a button. Okay. So I'm going to pull in button details here. So when it comes to these two reports, so let's maybe unpack what these two buttons might do first. And again, when I say buttons, I'm saying buttons because this is the designer in me saying that these two buttons here are button components. So we have one button that downloads a report. So what that does is it takes a specific action. So buttons usually in the eyes of developers download something. They open a modal. They play a video. They move carousel side to side. Those are buttons in the eyes of developers. So in the case of this download report button, we are going to say that this is a button. Okay. Now I know what you're thinking is like, Kirk, come on, do we really need to call this out? What is a button and what is not? Yes, we do, because there's more that goes into this than what meets the eye. Because sure, a really experienced developer might understand this, or like a developer who used to be a designer and say, okay, this is a button. But there's actually a whole lot more that goes into it for a developer than just developing a button. They need accessible names. They need descriptions for form readers. They need a type. Okay, these are all things that your developer is going to be thinking about when they're actually building out the design. So unless you call it out explicitly for them, chances are it might not make it in, or if it makes it in, it isn't going to work the way a designer would want it to work. So let's unpack each of these next. But before we do that, one thing we're going to do is we're going to look at our View Executive Summary link, because they share a lot of the same properties in terms of their annotation. Okay, so now let's look at the link. Now, I turned my hat around backwards just for the vibes. So let's go into search link here and pull in our link stamp and also our link details. If it'll pull in for me. There we go. Let's rock and roll. Okay, so with this View Executive Summary, let's just say, for hypothetical sake, I could probably use this take action button in like the alert banner, but I'm not going to do that. Let's just say, just for purposes of this exercise, that this View Executive Summary button takes the user of this dashboard to another page, which is a summary of everything to do with the dashboard, a little bit more of like a client-friendly format. I don't know, something like that. Imagine with me here. So because what this is actually going to do is going to take the user to a completely separate page. Despite the fact that this is a button component, a developer is going to look at this and say that is a link. Notice how, with that, you can see how developers are not thinking the same as designers, and vice versa. So, again, because it is a button, although it is a button component, because it takes the user to an entirely different page, it is a link. And of course, Figma is super slow for me all of a sudden. So now we can also apply the link details annotations. Now, again, very similar to our button details is we have all of these other items that we can simply toggle on if Figma will stop being so slow for me. There we go. That again are going to help our developers build the most accessible product possible with things like our targets, with our accessible names, our descriptions that oftentimes they're not really usually thinking about. So let's take a quick look at what a lot of these things mean and how we can talk about these to our developers in a way that they're going to understand. Okay, so before we dive in to what each of these elements are and their purpose, one thing I want to make crystal clear right off the bat is when you do this, loop in your developers. They might want things structured a certain way. They might ask for you to include other pieces of information. I'll go through a couple examples as to what I mean. Again, I've just worked with so many developers in my day where different developers prefer things structured a different way and different pieces of information included. So we can go through this at a high level, but again, your developer might prefer it a different way. So always loop them into the process. Okay, so let's look at accessible name and description. One thing we're going to look at a little bit later is actually like reading designs, like looking at it through the lens of someone who is visually impaired. So they actually have to look at this from a screen reader. Now, your developers likely, if you just give them a design and given the timeline that they're on, they might not include things like accessible name, accessible descriptions. And what that's going to do is it's going to force them or cause them to not actually build an accessible design. So let's look at what the accessible name and description are, okay? Because they're the same for both buttons and links. So starting off with our download report button. The accessible name, like the starting point, is always just what it is, right? It's just download report, okay? And then the description would be downloads summary reports of all the data on the dashboard. So basically your accessible name is if someone is going through your application through a screen reader, the accessible name is the name of the button. So download report. Then if they need additional information, they're going to be able to understand what that is via the description, because the system's actually going to read the description back to them. So it'll be like download report, download summary report of all the data on the dashboard. So they know exactly what that button is going to do. Because again, they can't look at the dashboard holistically to understand what it is that they're going to be downloading. But that's the purpose of like the description. Okay. And again, the description can be improved upon here. I'm not a content designer. Okay. Don't sue me. Okay. So let's look at the same thing for the executive summary. So we're going to look at target and the other elements shortly, but again, just accessible name, view executive summary, description, views a client-friendly format of all the summary information. Again, so when a screen reader is looking at this link, view executive summary, views a client-friendly format of all the summary information. And again, this is where you should loop in a content designer in order to actually help you build like the most meaningful piece of content here. Because again, as designers, we're not always copy people. Okay, so that's the purpose of the accessible name in the description, mostly for screen readers. And again, developers need to know this because they need to program that into their code itself. But now let's look at some of the other pieces of information here, like type, target, and other things that we might want to include. Okay, so let's start off with like the easy one, which is target. Now, any guesses as to what that is? Okay, it's a target. It's where does this link ultimately go? Okay, so what this can be, it can either be a section of a page, like as I was talking about earlier in the example, it can be like FAQ. Okay, so
Usually you always put like the hashtag in front of it to sort of signify that it goes down to a specific part of the page, or it can even be like an FAQ page itself, or in this case, sorry, it's a horrible example, like executive dash summary. Now, where things can get pretty tricky is if it takes a user to a page, but it takes them to a specific part of that page. So usually what I do, again, there's different ways that developers prefer things to be laid out, is set the target to like executive summary. And then in the more details about the link, you can add like proceed to FAQ section. So basically what this is then telling the developer is that the target's the executive summary page. When they navigate there, they're not just going to go to the top of the page, they're actually going to be navigated down to the FAQ section of that page itself. Okay, so you're going to notice that, see how we're starting to lay things out for the developers in a way that they're going to understand that if we didn't do this, instead of taking them to the FAQ section, again, just an example, they might be taken to the executive summary page, and then you're going to need to submit a Jira ticket for them to then go down to that section upon navigation to the executive summary page. See how we're making everyone's lives easier? Okay, so next is look at some things like type for the button before we move down the list, look at all our other annotations as well. Okay, so now let's look at type. Okay, now if this was like a form button, the type would be something like submit. Again, this is where you should chat with your developers, honestly. Again, I've heard so many different things from so many different developers over the years. But in the case of this download button, the type might be a download. And again, developers are going to have their own certain terminology. Again, for this, it's pretty consistent, but I forget the specifics of it. So again, ask your developers. So because we're downloading a report, the type here would be download. It wouldn't be submit because it's not a form that we're submitting. So it's more relevant to the action that's being taken. If it's a modal, it could be something like open. Again, I forget the specific terminology for it. Don't sue me. Okay. So also too is if you're working at like a really complex institution, like download what? Right? Is a developer going to know that like the specific PDF that needs to be downloaded? So why not call out more details about it? Okay. So in the details section, say needs to download, report or file name, something like that. So they know exactly the specifics as to what needs to be downloaded. Also, too, it could be something like open. So if it's open, what modal are they opening? Don't just expect them to look at a Figma file and be able to understand the interaction, especially, like, again, we're designers. We know how crazy Figma files can get. We might have 50 different modals floating around. Call out specifically the modal that needs to be opened when this button is hit. Okay. So hopefully now you can see how type also goes a really long way because not everything is submit. And also, too, call it specifics as to what the type does. What's the file that's being downloaded? What's the modal that's being opened? Again, it's going to go a long way to reducing additional Jira tickets later down the line. So next are heading annotations. Now, one conversation I've had in the past working with developers, again, this was a number of years ago when I was working at a really small agency. When I say it was a small agency, it was like when I first got started in design, I was interning at like a really small agency in my hometown. It was actually run out of a garage, but anyways, there's a total other tangent. Maybe I'll do a video on that another day. But one question I got from the developers at the time is, let's say I had like a heading here. Okay, picture it's like a marketing website. And this year it was an H1 semi-bold. Or just center this. And then I had a H3 semi-bold. So you had like a heading, I had a section, and then I had a heading, and then I had another section, and then I had a heading, and then another section. So maybe this heading actually went up to like an H2. Okay? Because designers know that design isn't always as linear, right? Especially with like modern design, there's so many different types of like text styles, super large text, and you go to super small text, vice versa. And what ended up happening, so here I have an H1, and then the next section had an H3, and the next section had an H2. Okay, client loved it. It looked awesome. But the developer who was actually building it out, one of the guys in our team, he comes to me and says, Kirk, that's not right. And I was like, oh, like, what do you mean? Like, the design's sick. He goes, oh, this should actually be an H2. And then this should actually be an H3. And I'm like, whoa. Like, you're ruining my design. Because there's like the misconception that headings need to be super linear, where you have to go from an H1 to an H2 to an H3. And that's not always the case. But developers, when they actually program that out, what screen readers are going to be doing is they're going from an H1, then they're going to be looking for an H2, because that's like the logical way that should be done. But design's not always that linear. So if you're mix and matching, like if your designs don't follow like an H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, or an H1, H2, H3, H1, H2, H3, if your designs don't follow that order, you actually need to call that out for the developer specifically so that they program it in a way that can be read by a screen reader. Let's look at an additional example. Okay, so table stake stuff right here. If we have an H1, it's an H1. If we have an H2, it's an H2. And if we have an H3, it's an H3. But where this gets tricky is, say we have an H1 over here. So bring in our H1 tag. And then we have an H3. Oops, sorry. Then we have an H3 below it. Okay. All of a sudden then, from a programmatic standpoint, this might be an H2. Then if we have an H2 below an H3, then all of a sudden, this here might be an H3. Because this is where, again, where developers and designers are not thinking the same. We are looking at it as designers as just like the text style level, an H1, an H2, an H3, because that's what our Figma typography style is saying. But the developers need to program this in a way that can be understood by a screen reader. So although that this here is using an H3 Figma style, from a program side, this might need to be labeled as an H2. So let's look at applying this to an actual page. Again, this is a little bit more of it's an easier concept to understand once you fully grasp it. And again, this is 100% talk with your developers around it, because they might have other ways around doing it. I've worked with developers in the past who said, don't even worry about doing this because they have their own ways that they handle it. Don't ask specifics. I don't know. But this is something that you should be thinking about, talking with your developers in order so that they actually build the most accessible product possible. So maybe before we look at applying it to a real example, again, it's a pretty simple example once you've grasped it, as I said. One thing you don't want to do is start having all these different H tags on specific pages, okay? I think we're witnessing a Figma bug in real time here, because now all of a sudden my table is not loading despite the component being there. Anyways, I digress. So like we can put like an H tag, a heading stamp here, where in the case where this here is an H6, what we can do is we can actually set this to an H1, okay? So this here is going to be our H1. I guess there's our example that we're going to cover. But one thing you don't need to do is, like, for every single one of your text elements, you don't need to apply an H tag. Say if that's an H6, like you don't need absolutely everything that is any type of like H tag. You don't need to do this, is basically what I'm getting at. This is where collaborate with your developers. What is it that they want called out, and what is it that they don't want called out? Because if you start handing them a design where there's like 400 different H tags looking around on top of all the other annotations that we're going to add, they're going to be like, yo, pause. Like, what are we even doing here? So this is where it's a good idea when you're going through this, chat with your developers around what it is that they want you to mark, what it is that they do not want to mark. Now, what about the notes specific to it? Okay, let's look at that next. So now let's look at the actual annotation itself. Now, you don't always need a heading details annotation. Now, I know we're getting more into accessibility things than anything else, but again, developers still need to code this in. And accessibility, whether or not you want to do it, goes a long way to building an actual product that everyone can use. So if we look at this heading here, welcome back, Kirk. Does that need a description? No, because if it's read by a screen reader, oh, I'm just being welcomed back, thanks, right? But if this was just dashboard, okay, what kind of dashboard? Or if this was just like information, okay, like information on what, right? So depending on how you're set up, again, you might have subtext beneath it where explaining like what this page is for. In that case, you probably don't need a heading details. But if it's just super bland, like dashboard, In the case of this page here, maybe you're viewing household specific data, like you're a financial advisor and you're viewing household specific data, add details about that. A dashboard consisting of summary level household data. Something as simple as that. You're basically giving it more information as to what that heading is referring to. Again, whether or not you need this, chat with your developers. They might have other ways around it. And two, one thing you're going to see once we get a little bit later, once we get into like tab order and reading order, you're going to find headings like a little bit less relevant in some cases. Chatting with developers, sometimes it is a little less relevant depending on how they use tab order, reading order. Every developer is different. They have their own ways of doing things. I don't know. But again, that's heading details in a nutshell. Now, image details, something everyone tends to skip, but developers are going to need. Okay, because you think about, like, again, screen reader. Again, this is still accessibility, but helps developers. Anyways, I digress. Think about a screen reader. Here I have a picture of me in Bali from like a year and a half ago, where I was at like some like volcano thing. Again, I'm kind of cool. Is if this is being looked at by a screen reader, developers are going to need to know the accessible name. So essentially what this is the alt text. You're describing the image for the screen reader. So in this case, it can be Kirk sitting on a Jeep on a volcano on the side of a volcano in Bali, watching the sunset, but turned away. So now if someone's on a screen reader, they know exactly that this image is of me sitting on the side of it, sitting on a Jeep on the side of a volcano in Bali, watching the sunset, but turned away from the camera. Pretty descriptive, right? Now, again, underrated thing to include, but it goes a really long way, and your developers are going to love it, because when that gets tested from an accessibility lens by someone in QA, they're not going to go to the developer and say, hey, we need an accessible name because there's no alt text here, right? Makes lives easier all around. Now, one thing that gets people a little bit, what word am I looking for? Stuck, or not stuck, but people are always confused as to why you need it, is like the element. Is it an image or an SVG? Okay, let's look at why, and an image is probably a bad example for that. So we're going to pull in an icon and examine why we need to call that out specifically. Okay, so why we need to call out the elements is a lot of accessibility tools won't actually work unless the specific element's actually called out. Now, as much as designers would like to think that, developers will always look at an icon and say that's an SVG, or always look at an image and say that's an image, it's not always the case, believe it or not. Okay, if this icon is downloaded as an SVG, but as an image, it might render strangely. So it's always super important to call it out. Also, too, at the same time, SVGs don't have an accessibility name. So if it's an SVG, you can just take out the accessibility name altogether. Now, this is super unnecessary in my eyes, because you can chat with your developers, especially if you already have a design system. And again, the reason why I'm covering this is based off of the video I filmed earlier on in the year. I got a ton of questions relating to this from those who are using this web accessibility annotation kit. Is you can come into an agreement with your developers, especially if you have a design system in Figma where all your icons are SVGs, where you don't need to call this out. Okay, you really, really don't. But for the purposes of this video, I'm calling it out anyway, so that you're an expert on this. As you can come to an agreement with your developers and say, look, all of our icons are going to be SVGs. None of our icons will ever be an image. And if they are, they're going to be called out specifically. Okay. So in my opinion, this level of detail is super unnecessary, but the people asked for it, so I'm delivering. One of the things that I've heard from developers, one of the things that drives them the absolute, what drives them crazy, is when they have to go back and adjust a reading order once their application or developed design was tested by a screen reader, by a QA or accessibility expert, and also try to figure out the reading order in advance. Again, a lot of designers don't know how to do this. Now, what your reading order does is it allows a screen reader to sort of go element by element to know what the order in which that copy should be read so that it makes sense to someone. Okay, because us as designers, we like to include a lot of elements that are just more nice to haves, but they don't really serve always like a functional purpose. Let's look at an example here. So screen readers always go top, bottom, left, right, like normal reading. So if this was to be read by a screen reader, it'd be account managing my account. It's kind of weird because the title would tell you that it has to do with your account. So you might not even want to include this being read by a screen reader. And if you did, chances are you actually might want to include it sort of as one of the last things that's read. So, like managing my account, edit your profile, change your profile, and more, category, account, manage now. Okay. But where this can get tricky is if, um, say this was something like security, and then this was like the tag of like something like compliance. Okay. You don't necessarily know what kind of security that you're talking about. So I was to change this to something like maybe like where's an error? There we go. So you might not necessarily know, or someone who's on a screen reader might not necessarily know that security is referencing like enterprise compliance. It could just be like your password more than anything, which doesn't always have to do with enterprise level compliance. So this reading order might be a little bit different. So now you're seeing how this can like get kind of complex and kind of tricky, because you might, in this case, you actually might want that tag to be read first. Category compliance, security. Perfect. Makes a little bit more sense than account, managing my account. You see how it's like going back and forth between the two? Things can kind of get a little bit like tricky and a little bit awkward in some cases. So this is why calling out the reading order is super important. Now, one thing I would like to call out as well is if you have different reading orders for the exact same type of like card, it's going to get confusing. Someone's on a screen reader, they're going to get confused, and developers are going to get confused as well. So that's why it's important to take stock of all the elements that you're going to be including in the reading order to come up with the best possible approach. So with this, I want to visualize what the reading order does and why it's so important, and like where things like accessible name and stuff come into play when your developers are actually building out an application. Now, I always use like banking websites as a reference because they tend to do it pretty well, just given like high table stakes and large budgets for things like this. So what I have is I actually have a Chrome extension running in the background. If you just search screen reader, you can download one and just try it out. But I'm going to click on something and I want you to listen to the reading order. So ready for this? So in this case, the screen reader, it can just sort of choose what select is. So I'm going to click on this, and I hope you might be able to hear it. But anyways, here we go.
RBC checking account offer open and eligible. RBC checking account and get the new iPad offer ends November 3rd, 2025. Conditions apply. View offer details.
Simple, right? So again, this is a little bit more of a complex use case, or an easier use case, just because the structure of things is quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's methodical. It's in the right order. Everything's like one after the other. But you can see why having the reading order labeled to your developers can help program that into their code, can go a long way to impaired users actually understanding your application. Now, we're to come back to this type of demo a little bit later once we get into the tab order. Let's look at actually marking off our reading order inside some of the items that we had just looked at. Okay, so go into the Web Accessibility Annotation Kit and pull in details relating to the reading order. Now, for simple things like this, as I said, it's really that easy, like reading order 1, reading order 2, and then reading order 3. Okay? Reading order 3. Where things can get kind of tricky is if all of a sudden you have elements that you might not want to include. Okay. Now, if you think back to a little bit earlier on, how I was sort of talking about how depending on the content here, the tag could be relevant or it could not be relevant. But for someone on a screen reader and they're viewing or they're listening to the exact same type of like elements, if the order changes, that's going to confuse them. And if the order changes between the exact same elements, that's also going to confuse your developers. So if you want to leave elements out, you're going to need to call it out specifically here. What you can even do is just literally just like remove the number and set it to above and say we don't want to use these tags. Okay. Again, because maybe the H tag that we have here can really just take the place of the tag, and the tags are more of just like a filling up white space element that us designers just like to include in a lot of things. We can say specifically, leave this out. This is more of a visual element. The title will be descriptive enough. Okay. So now your developers have rationale as to why this reading order is a certain way in elements that they can mark as like not readable for the screen reader. Okay. So again, reading order details goes a really long way to building an accessible product, and to labeling it helps your developers build it into their code the very first time, so they don't have to go to QA, get feedback, try to determine the reading order themselves. Because again, not every element that you include in your design needs to be read by a screen reader, and the order in which things flow might not always make the most logical sense. Okay, so now let's look at our tab order annotation. So very similar to our reading order annotations, is developers still actually need to code this into the code. Okay, so again, here I am just on the Royal Bank of Canada website. Okay, one thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to refresh this page. Okay, I get 2 banners there, kind of weird. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be pressing tab. And as I press tab, what it's going to do is that's going to navigate me throughout the page. So again, picture someone on a screen reader navigating the website using the tab key. Because again, they don't have a mouse, they might have a mouse, so they might have a trackpad, because if they're visually impaired, they might not be able to see exactly what's going on. So they're going to be using the tab key in order to navigate. And again, developers need to code this into their code. So I'm using the tab key here. Okay. So we get financial relief program, close. Financial relief program, close. Okay. So then what happens is we go skip to main content. Then we go personal, business, wealth, institutional, about RBC, promotions, Royal Bank logo, search, contact, English, sign in, accounts, credit card, mortgage, loans, investments, rewards, advice, little menu thing. Then we get into view offer details. And then it takes me down the page to everything else. Okay. So I'm not using a mouse or a trackpad. I'm only navigating using the tab key. Okay, then we go view all the way down the line. Okay, what's a couple weird things that we noticed with that is that it took us to the Royal Bank, like the logo, but we're already on that page. Kind of weird. I've seen a lot of cases where people might include that out of the tab order because you're already on the homepage. But now if I was, okay, so I've been here for a while, and now I'm at the top again, I just sort of clicked away. Now I start navigating using the tab key. Notice how it takes me to view offer details. It skips everything else. And then what it does, it takes me right down. So there's different orders of tab orders that can go into your website design that your developers are going to need to program in, versus if someone's visiting for the first time or like refresh the page, versus if they've already been on the page. Additionally, there might be elements here that you want users to skip. In the case of that Royal Bank logo, what's the purpose of clicking it if you're already on the Royal Bank homepage, right? If I was on a completely other page and I wanted to go home, sure, it might make sense. But on the homepage, do you really need to include that in a tab order? Maybe, maybe not. So hopefully that's a good example as to how important a tab order can be when it comes to working with your developers in order to build an actual accessible product. Because again, if you don't call out the tab order, the developer is going to have to guess what that tab order would be, and there's no guarantee that they're always going to get it right. So avoid the extra Jira tickets. Call this out on your designs. So for this one, I'm just using screenshots they took from the Royal Bank website just because it's easier for me to like go through it. Now, you'll recall in like that demo that I just did, how if I refreshed, like came to the page for the first time, there was a different tab order, because what it did is it took me all the way through each of these elements first. And then if I had just like had been on the page for a while, it took me right to view offer details, then further down the page. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves here in terms of how we set up a lot of the edge cases. Again, we're going to look at some of these later on, like error states and all that kind of fun stuff, to help our developers build those out the first time. But it's a similar concept as like what we're doing here, right? So what you might want to do in this case is, again, I don't have the right like annotation format in front of me. We're going to get to that later. Anyways, you might want to include a user story here. So I, as a user, land on the Royal Bank website for the first time or refresh. Okay, website should not be capitalized. Let's detach that. Go like body. Let's go like a hero. Yeah, bold. Oops, sorry, it's too big. Maybe like a H2 medium. There we go. So I, as a user, land on the Royal Bank website for the first time or refreshed. Okay. Again, the format of this we're going to work on a little bit later, so like it makes sense and it's clean, but just as an example. And then for this one, I, as a user, have been on the Royal Bank website for some time. Again, this is an example, and no longer, we'll just leave it at that. Okay. So what we can do that is we can go into the Web Accessibility Annotation Kit. It's actually called focus state. Sorry, I know I said like tab order, but it's actually called like your focus state. Okay. So now what we're doing is we're building out 2 different tab orders based on different use cases. And again, this might be 2 different Jira tickets, it might be 1 Jira ticket, whatever. So you're going to recall before, if this is at the bottom, oops, sorry, above, there we go. So this was tab order 1. This was tab order 2. This was tab order 3. This was tab order 4. This was tab order 5. And then it went all the way to promotions. 6. Oops, if I can enter that right. And then this one here was 7. I know we're going to stop here, so you don't need to watch me go through all of them. This was right. There we go. And this here was like our 7 tab order. Okay. Whereas if we've already been on the website for the first time, we skipped all of like the core navigation pieces, which would be able to access still from like our screen reader and like different elements on like our keyboard. But we just jumped right to the view offer details. And this was 1. So you can see how the tab order or the focus order, depending on the terminology that you want to use, can be so confusing for developers. Because again, if you've been on the website for some time, you might want to skip some of the initial elements, like any alerts that come up, things like that, your promotions. But if I'm new, you might want to take them through some of those alerts, some of those promotions and things like that. Okay. So again, don't leave your tab or focus order for your developers to guess. You know the product better than anyone. Call it out for them. Now, this is probably the one that I'm probably most excited about, is the input annotations, because it's such low lift but a high reward, both for the developer but then also for the user as well. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a real simple example here. We just have like the sign up or login form. Okay, so we're going to call this out as an input. Now, if I bring in our input details, again, we have 4 here to start, but then I'm going to toggle on our advanced mode and get into the more complex details. Okay, let's look at type to start. For a name, that type is going to be text. So essentially what this is doing is defining sort of the field level validation that needs to happen. But if I was to move this down to, email as an example, the type would be email. So if an email was not entered or properly formatted, the system would be able to know, again, developer needs to code this in, that this needs to be an email format, or your email is not properly formatted. If this was a phone number, same thing. Type would be number, because it needs to be a number. You cannot have any other special characters inside of that value. Okay, again, low lift but high reward. Also too, is it required? Yes or no? This is one that's always left out, and I know it drives developers crazy, because I worked with so many developers who had no idea what was required and what was not, and a whole bunch of validation was wrong. Okay, now I get here for this example, name, email, password, probably all required. And once you get into some more like complex like onboarding structures, or maybe you're applying to a job, you don't necessarily need to fill out one specific field, like for any extra links that you might have, that might not be required. But unless you call that out specifically, the developer is going to think that that field is required. So why not mark it as true or false? Also too, autocomplete. Should these fields autocomplete what's already saved in the system? Or as I'm typing, should it show a drop down, sort of like a suggested box, right? This is where you can get into some of those elements as well. Also too, input mode. This is more relevant for mobile users than anything else. But if I enter, like if I'm filling out this form on my iPhone and I hit name, I want to see the actual keyboard pop up. So I want that to be text. But if I'm entering in a phone number, I don't want the keyboard to pop up with all the letters, where I have to then switch to the numbers. I want the number keyboard to pop up, and that is what input mode is referring to. And again, if you have any questions specific to that, like you can click on these and it takes you to the Mozilla docs for that. But at a high level, there's some input details that you can include to help make the lives of your developers a little bit easier. Now, as I said, low lift, high reward. This should take you 10 seconds to fill out, but it's going to save your developers 30 minutes of thinking or back and forth if they're not sure. Okay. Now, let's look at the advanced mode next. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is just toggled on the advanced mode. We have some additional ones that pop up. Now, one thing I'm going to remove right away that I've just been told too many times is irrelevant is size. So I'm just going to delete it. It's not really needed anymore. But these are things that also developers are going to be thinking about. What's the max length for a name? What's the max length for, an email? What's the min length for a name or last name? What's the title? So essentially what this is referring to here is essentially any additional details that the user might need to know. Whereas if this is name, your title might be, if you're not calling out explicitly first name, last name, enter your first name and last name. Okay, so think of it like an accessibility label that we were looking at a little bit earlier on. And also too, is this disabled? And what's any logic around when this should be disabled and when it's not disabled? Okay, so if it is disabled, call out specifically why it's disabled. In this case, maybe password is disabled until you enter in your email. So password is disabled until you enter an email. Again, this is one that I've seen all the time too, where what a lot of designers will do is in their designs, they might have a field that's disabled, but they don't call it explicitly how to unlock that field. And again, that's an extra conversation for your developers. That's an extra Jira ticket that they're going to have to tackle. So why not just call it out in advance? So as I mentioned, your input details, low effort, super high reward. This isn't like some of the other ones where you actually might need to think about it, like your focus order or anything like that. You should be able to usually handle this on your own. But again, it's going to save your developers a ton of time and a ton of guesswork. Okay, so next we need to call out specific landmark annotations for our developers. Now, there's a couple different use cases for which this is necessary. We're going to look at one, which is a recipe example, and then we'll switch actually over to Framer. I'm sure you've heard of it by now, like Framer, the website builder, and like show you how they tend to handle it, and like another reason why it's also so important. But a landmark annotation in the context of like a website like this, especially one that's really long, like a recipe website. Again, I just took the screenshot, but like you're going to see that there's like a whole bunch of content relating to the background of the recipe, what it is, how to make it. But then below that, you actually get into the specific ingredients. And then even below that, you get into the instructions. But if you're on a screen reader, again, you have to go through this. All the content to actually get to the heart of the action is going to take you forever. Sometimes you just want to skip to specific sections. And that's the purpose of landmark annotations, where we can actually call out specific sections that a user would be able to jump to inside of a screen reader. But it goes beyond just screen readers as well. So let's switch over to Framer and look at that example. Okay, so here we are within Framer. Okay, and again, this is an actual site that I have published and public for our design system agency, Design System Labs. Again, if you need design system support, we're your guys from coded components, enterprise components, Figma components, whatever you need. Okay, there's my sales pitch. So if we think about it, so we have this book of call. And again, this is a site that I don't spend a whole lot of time on because I'm busy with actual client work and like building UI collective. So forgive any UX errors. Is if we think about book a call, okay. Developer is going to ask, sorry, let me shrink the size of this canvas here. There we go. So I can see all of it. Sorry, I got to shrink it even a little bit more. Sorry about that. Perfect. So you see this book a call button here. In the case of this prototype, if I was to play it, this book a call section takes me to the bottom of the page. That's also a landmark, okay? Because we're taking a user to a specific section. So if we look here at this section, they call it like scroll section instead of landmark, but ultimately they're doing the same thing. Is we're giving it a name as contact, and then with this button here, we're giving it a link to home and then the specific section. So if you think back to the link component that we were talking about a little bit earlier on in this video, how you might specify sort of the page that it goes to, then the specific section of the page. That specific section of the page needs a name. And that is what's called your landmark. Okay. So separate from like the recipe example, here's a real world example where it's used in an actual CMS, but it just calls something a little bit different. So hopefully you can visualize that pretty well. Okay. So let's look at just a simple example here as to like how we can set these up and how I set them up in the past. Okay. Now, what I tend to do whenever I have landmark annotations, I don't include this inside the frame. Sorry, let me move this thing over. Is I might include like a 2-pixel dotted line across. And one thing you can do also as well is make it dashed if you want to. And basically what this is doing, you can even make it like something that stands out where it's like a red. Okay, and let me maybe just shrink this width. This is how I tend to lay it out in like a lot of like my designs here, as that's how I mark what the landmark is. So in this case, we're gonna have a couple landmarks, maybe one for payment method, and then maybe another one for security. So there's the first one, and then we're gonna have one down here as well. Okay, so maybe another one here. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, sort of how I like to set up those landmarks in a way which my developers will be able to understand on the file itself, let's look at the landmark details. Okay, so let's go ahead now and look at the elements. So the elements is basically just defining if it's a section, if it's the main piece of content, if it's a header, if it's a form, a footer, so on and so forth. So really, really that simple in the grand scheme of things. So if we look at these parts here, so the payment methods and the security, these here would be a section, okay? Now, we have a room for additional details. You're going to see here at this section, like add the name and the role. You don't really need to, okay, because that's kind of in the accessible name itself. So in this section here, this would just be payment methods. Payment methods. It's very rare for me to have any additional details for the sections, okay? Now, if we go to our recipe example here, is if we look at this, maybe this here, let me think about it actually. What might be the main piece of content on this page? It would be how to make. Oops, sorry, let me move all of these up. So how to make chicken, this might be the main section of the page. So here it's going to be how to make. So then a user on a screen reader, your developer would actually be able to code this into the system where they'd be able to skip to the main piece of content. Because if we look at the recipe example, we have all this content, which is kind of just fluff for like SEO purposes more than anything else. You want to be able to skip to the main piece of content. So we have how to make, and then we might have different sections above and below. So this might be a section where it's like introducing the recipe. Again, you might also have additional pieces here as well. Sorry, I know it's tough. Where this here might be, if we put this from above, there we go. And then you can have other elements here, like where this is like your navigation. So you don't even really need an accessible name for the navigation, just based off my own experience and just working with different developers, because the navigation is a navigation, okay? So, and that's how you can use landmark details to call out specifically different sections that can be programmed for a screen reader, but also for buttons as well, okay? Because we think back to our button annotation, again, as I was saying a little bit earlier on, or sorry, our link annotation, not our button annotation. See, even I'm getting confused sometimes, where you're gonna have to specify the page that it goes to, then also the section. The section that it goes to is usually referred to from a development standpoint as a landmark. So this one kind of goes a little bit under the radar, but again, makes developers' lives a whole lot easier. If we as designers, call it out. So now I want to talk about file structure. This one goes so under the radar because designers know how to navigate Figma files because we're the ones building within them. But then when we hand developers a Figma link and we just expect them to say, oh yeah, this is where to look, it's like, come on, man, there's 400 million designs here, all the different iterations, everything along the lines. So whenever I start setting up my Figma file, is I generally have a pretty good idea as the number of pages that I need. Okay, if I'm working on a large enterprise application, I know there's gonna be it's gonna be a ton of screens, all these different features. But if I'm working on something small, there's really no need to separate everything out into a bunch of different pages because the developers are automatically going to know where to look. So a good rule of thumb that I always like to follow is for larger applications, separate out the pages by feature that developers are going to be working on. What I mean by that is you might have an onboarding, you might have a dashboard, you might have payments, you might have settings. So you can see it's already like categorized in a way based on the page name, where developers, if they're looking for something specifically, they're going to be able to navigate in here to go towards the specific page that they're looking for. Okay. But again, this isn't always the case. This is more for like more complex applications, as I said, but you don't need to overcomplicate things. So if you're working on a really small application, like a micro tool or something like that, you're passing off to your developers, there's no need for 3 different pages. Don't overcomplicate it if you don't need to. I've seen this all the time where, if you're working on a smaller application, you might, what I have seen before, and I know for a fact that this drives developers crazy, where you might have a sign up, and what designers would do is they'd have a sign up page, and then they duplicate this, and then they have a dashboard, right? So they duplicate this, you have a dashboard, you have a dashboard, and then you would duplicate this, and then you would have your settings. And then what they would do is that they have one page with like a prototype where they link it all together. What are some issues with that right away? Is there really a need for 3 different pages if there's not many screens on each page? Because then you need a separate page for a prototype. And then the developers are going to be looking at the prototype, but what they should be doing is actually looking at the main files here that you have gone ahead and marked for dev. So if you're working on a smaller application, a smaller page where you don't have a ton of different files, man, just like combine them into one, right? So you would just have designs. Really, it can really be that simple. Delete everything else. Then what you can do is separate it out into different sections. So let's say you might have a sign up and a login. So if I set this like FA, there we go. Where you might have a sign up, you might have a login. Then, sorry if I extend this out. And then you have a 2-factor authentication page, something like that. And then you could call this section onboarding. That's simple. And then what you can do is you can just call this section dashboard. Okay. Dashboard or in-app experience. So again, if I change this background to FA, then you can have all the pages relating to your dashboard. You might have a dashboard. You might have something like accounts. You might have, if it's a finance app, you might have something like holdings. Okay, really just what are the core key pages of your main in-app navigation. And then you can have another page for smaller secondary items, which you can call secondary items. Again, I've seen this before too, for things like settings, change password, terms. Because if you're working on a smaller application, now the design file that you're building everything in, you can actually build the prototype within it. So you don't need to break everything out into different pages if there really is no need to. Because then all on one page, you can combine everything such as your annotations. You can combine different error states that we're going to look at very shortly. And it makes developers' lives a whole lot easier. So moral of the story, don't overcomplicate your file structure for the sake of overcomplicating your file structure, because remember that your developers need to come in here too and need to know where to look. Okay, so let's just call this sort of a simple version, okay? And this is the formats that like I tend to use and that my developers tend to really like, but I'm not to say that this is like a right or wrong way to do it. Your developers might prefer you to use a different way than the way that I'm showing you here. This is just my approach. Sue me if you want to, okay? So what we're going to do then is let's just add a divider in between, and let's just like duplicate this file. And this is going to be our like more complex view, okay? Complex view. So, or not complex view. This will be a complex view, but maybe for something like our onboarding. So let's get rid of our dashboard. Okay. So if this was our onboarding, say we did have like this really large enterprise application, we would have onboarding. We would also have our, our dashboard. Let's stick with onboarding and dashboard for now, because they're the only 2 examples that I can really think of. Okay. Or maybe like even like feature based. So maybe you have like a network section of your application, and then like a cash flow section of your application. Okay, because with onboarding, right? I'm trying to think of a really complex example here. So there could be different onboarding states based on different feature sets or based on different user types. So whether you're a senior user or a new investor, there are going to be different onboarding flows that you would have to go into. So if that's the case, you're within the onboarding page, but make your developer's life easier. Call it onboarding user type 1. User type 1. So let's think of a simple example here. So say I'm building an application for designers and developers. This here would be onboarding designers. And then this here would be onboarding developers. Okay. Also too, you can even start to break it out into different sections where sure, this is onboarding. This can be your onboarding designers. And now you can duplicate this and have an onboarding for developers. Onboarding for developers. And then you can add a dash in between to really separate out the features and the functionality. The concept here is about grouping relating elements together. If the app is complex enough where designers and developers are going to have 50 screens each, save your developers the time from having to search for the right screen or having to try to navigate your Figma file. Just break it out. But if there's only like the 10 or 12 screens each, it's not the biggest lift in the world. Keep them on one screen, but just section them out. Okay. Super important in order to keep your Figma files clean so that your developers know where to look. So another big pain point whenever you're prepping for developer handoff is messy Figma pages. Okay, because I showed you roughly how to structure them up here against just some different approaches at a high level. Again, it's ultimately what makes sense for you more than anything else. But I just went online here. I just grabbed 2 sample screens. Okay, I just searched legit like messy Figma file and these came up. Now, the biggest pain point, not the biggest pain point, is one pain point. I know I say the biggest pain point a lot. Is handing a developer a file and they see something like this. Would you know where to look? Or this. Would you know where to look? No, you wouldn't, right? And I know it makes sense for us as designers because we're working within the Figma file. We know where everything is. But for a developer trying to locate a specific screen, if it's not linked and design team's unavailable or whatever it is, chances are they're going to grab the wrong screen. And when they grab the wrong screen, the wrong component, the wrong frame, that is what is going to end up getting into designs. So my biggest suggestion, normalize creating archives. Now, what that can be, okay, actually I'm going to leave these up here just for reference, is what that can be is you might have your core flow that what you're going to do is you're going to, where'd my Marcus Dev thing go? Here we go. Sorry. Yeah, mark this as ready for dev, but then you might have a completely separate frame that you're just going to call archive. Okay, and maybe it's way out of the way that contains all of your different iteration. It's still there for reference, but you've already marked this one as for dev, so devs know where to look. It's clean, and they don't have 2 or 3 million other assets floating around your section. I know this is table stakes stuff, but the amount of like companies that I've worked with, designers who I've worked with, where even myself as a Figma expert, okay, self-declared, of course, Figma expert, still learning every day though, where I open up their designs and I'm like, yo, I don't even know where to look, right? So if I don't know where to look and I use this tool every day and every night, how is a developer going to know where to look? So you can keep your archives in the same page, or also too, what I do is I just like duplicate this and then have like our onboarding archive down here to keep it even cleaner. Okay. So this would really just be all of your assets relating to your onboarding archive. So if you needed to go back to reference, you 110% could. So moral of the story here, do your developers a favor and clean up your Figma files prior to handing anything off to them. Highlight what are the important sections, remove all the other abstract items that don't need to be there, create an archive section, create an archive page for feature at an overall app level. Whatever approach works for you, whatever size application that you have, whatever you do, don't end up with something like this because your developers are going to go crazy. Okay, so now I want to talk about error or like edge cases that designers rarely ever provide their development team, but that their development team need to implement and actually come up with designs on their own. Like we've all been there before where, I can't say we've all been there before, but a common, something we've probably already gone through is something as simple as if, you know, a form field wasn't filled out correctly. What's the error message that goes along with that? That's just table stakes stuff, but we get into more complex use cases that developers still need to think about. So what's an error state? Again, I categorize all of these as sort of error states, but they're error states, edge cases, loading states, that kind of thing. I just categorize them into error states, so forgive me. But what's the view if something's loading? If a page is loading, is the user seeing a spinner? Are they seeing a skeleton loader? Why should it be up to a developer to understand? What's the view if a user submits something wrong? Again, what's the error state that they're going to see? Do they go to another page letting them know they need to go back? These are the kinds of questions that are in the developer's mind. What's the view if something does not load? Now, this can be if a page does not load, like a system level error, like we see there, or it can be if there's just an error pulling one specific type of data to feed a particular widget. So there's a difference there between if just a widget does not load versus if the whole page does not load, and thus signifying a system level error. These are the kind of edge cases that you as a designer needs to think about because these are the designs and sort of the error messages that you are going to need to provide the development team so they can build them in accordingly. But when you're going through the process, this is more table stake stuff, but I'm going to remind you about it anyway. Don't do this solo. Consult with your development team around the types of error states that you need and types of loading states that you need. For all you know, in your enterprise design system, there can already be templates for a lot of these things, 404 messages, system level errors. So if you don't consult with your development team, ultimately what you're going to be doing is just redoing rework and making their lives a little more difficult, because they're going to think that they're going to need to redevelop error states that they already have the code for. Also, too, review the designs with them. And we're going to touch upon this shortly, like how I sort of set up files to handle these things. But review the designs with them so that they have an understanding. Maybe there are use cases that you're not thinking about that other developers on the team are thinking about. Maybe one error state wouldn't necessarily work a certain way that you were envisioning. So review the designs with them. Don't just send them a section or tag them in a section and leave them to go through and find the specific error states. Also, too, chances are you're working within Jira, you're working within Linear, some type of like project management tool like that. Link these in the story itself. When I say link them in the story, I mean link the specific frame. Figma allows you to copy a link to a specific frame, a specific section. Link them in the story, so when the developer is going through the story, they know exactly what frame they're referring to. Again, don't leave them to go and try to find the right frame inside the Figma file. So this is where you can bake AI and ChatGPT into this process. Instead of trying to have it think about every single error state that you might possibly need, just take a screenshot, upload it to ChatGPT. Again, if you're working within sensitive client files, maybe don't do this unless you have an enterprise version of ChatGPT. But this is just a method that you can take. Describe your dashboard if you need to, and then have it return some error states and all that stuff. Now, one thing that's going to be important to note is that likely, we're going to see what it generates first. So I just took a screenshot of just one of these dashboards that we had in like the annotations. So review the following dashboard. And you can get more complex with your prompt too. It's like giving you an example. Review the following dashboard. Please provide system level error states and edge cases that should be designed for. System level error states and edge cases that should be designed for. Let's just see what comes up. I've actually never used this specific prompt before, but anyways. Okay, perfect. So here it's sort of giving me the global app level, where if there's a partial outage, it's saying some cards fail while others load. We're going to address that. So full screen banner with status link. Okay, so if everything's out, if authentication's expired, if you don't have the necessary permissions to view an executive summary or download a report, we're going to get to that one. Data freshness, like if they need to update the data, great. KPI cards, if something's not showing, or negative values. Okay, so now it's giving specific states for some of the individual cards itself, and it looks to be pretty in depth. Again, we're not going to go through these one by one. I'll probably pick a couple and sort of talk about sort of edge cases on that you can sort of apply to other ones. And it's even giving me some design patterns. Perfect. So there we have just a real simple way to come up with a starting point for these error states and these edge cases that you would review with your developers a little bit later on. So let's pick and choose a couple here. And one thing I don't see is like a loading state as well. So it's something we're going to need to add, but let's pick and choose a couple and go through them together. So before we get into some of like the like building out the edge cases and how I sort of approach them or look at them, one thing I always do is I always have the error states beneath the individual design. I've worked in a lot of companies, worked with a lot of clients where they have edge cases completely separate. And what happens then is I tend to see this a lot is files, they become quite busy. So you might have onboarding here. Okay. If I can spell onboarding. Again, similar to what we were looking at earlier, like some of the different ways that you can like approach file setup. And then all of a sudden at the end here, they have onboarding. And then inside of onboarding, they have a section, at the side here, they have error states. And then inside error states, they have a section for onboarding. And then they have a section, for dashboard. And it's just a little bit confusing and developers don't need to look. Your best bet, honestly, I promise you, just have, change this back to dashboard now. just have your error states directly within the section that holds the actual designs for the error states themselves. Make sure you're going to make your life easier, going to make the lives of your developers way easier too. One thing as well is don't underestimate how many error states you might need. ChatGPT gave us like a good amount. Not all of them are going to be required, but like the amount of times where I've worked with development teams where I start off with maybe like 7 or 8 error states, and then all of a sudden my section for error states goes from up there to all the way down here, and I have about 50 error states depending on the complexity of the design. You're going to be surprised. Okay, so please group your error states and edge cases quite closely to the actual design itself. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's look at some of those patterns. So the first thing first that you're always going to need, and this is something that ChatGPT did include by the looks of it, is a loading state. When this page is loading, what is it that appears? You know, you might think that, oh, developers have a treatment for it, but then what I see all the time is, sorry, I was going to remove all the layout, remove all the auto layout here entirely. So we can just go through and just do this easily. Perfect. So where did my loader go? I lost it. Oh, there it is. Is what I see all the time. Sorry, I'm just going to duplicate this now. Is developers might come back with just that, where it's just a loader in like just floating there, right? And it's not the best experience in the grand scheme of things. And I'm just seeing so many Figma bugs here. Like, no, my icon there isn't loading on the right, even though it's showing. I don't know what's going on. But anyways, so you don't want to leave even simple things like error states up for chance and sort of let a developer interpret, okay? So my personal preference is what I do with my error states. I always like to use a skeleton loader. I just have 2 sample ones here, okay? So what I actually do is I match the design with the skeleton loader. So extend that up. We have our elements here. So I just really just overlay it. And yeah, you don't really need to worry about auto layout for this, because ultimately developers just want to see like how it's supposed to be laid out and where those skeleton loaders actually go. Again, if you do want to use a spinner, then just include a spinner. I guess it's up to you and your design system. But you're just taking these skeleton loader components. I believe we have a tutorial on this in our Build a Design System series. I don't know for sure. And basically what you're doing is you're just matching it. So it's really that simple in the grand scheme of things. So set it up, so on and so forth. Sorry, we're almost there now, so I might as well just go with it. And then one more. And then one more down here. Okay, so there you have like your skeleton loader. Again, you're documenting the error state or the loading state so that your developer can figure it out. Okay, now one thing that's important to note too is you need to have the conversation. If you do have a sidebar, if everything's loading for the very first time, maybe these are also loading too. So that's where it's important to have a conversation. And then once these load, all the other pages are the only ones that have the skeletons. Those are the types of conversations that you need to have with your development team. Now, one thing that I do as well, okay, is I actually call out specifically what it is that the developer should be referencing. So I always put a little warning here. So skeleton loader for upon page load. Now, this is less relevant right now just because anyone could see that this is a skeleton, okay? And then maybe we set this to something like a pink. Oh, that's kind of harsh. Like a dark pink, and then maybe this is like a white. So it's almost like you have your annotation. Again, less relevant now because everyone should be able to see that like this is a skeleton component and like something's loading. But once you get into the more finite, complex edge cases, having the annotations above and to the side, and even like arrows and like pointing to specific elements is going to allow the developer to know what it is that they're looking at within these error states and also these edge cases. Now, still on loading states, it's a good rule of thumb to like, I've worked with junior designers in the past where I was going through this process with them. And what they actually did is they did this. Oops, sorry. Let me just auto position this all the way up here. Is they had individual skeleton loaders for all of the individual widgets. Okay, so they had like 15 different screens, like one where this was loading and one where this was loading, this was loading, this was loading. From a user experience standpoint, it's best if everything loads at once. And if one thing doesn't load, then throw like a system level error telling them to refresh. Okay. So when it comes to your loading states, try to just have one screen. You don't need individual screens with all of these broken out, unless like your developers are explicitly telling you to for a specific reason, but chances are that's going to be relatively slim. Okay. So good rule of thumb is until everything fully loads, show everything as fully loading, just from an experience standpoint. Okay, so now let's look at those system level errors and how to approach that. One thing as well too, always be sure to include a section here for loading states. So a section within a section that houses all the necessary loading states. So in the chance where a developer does have to come in and look for something specifically, they see the design, perfect, marked ready for dev, and then come down and look for the specific category of state that they're looking for. Okay, so now let's move on to our system level alerts. So one thing I didn't really cover when I was generating like the initial ones from ChatGPT is you sort of have like these basic ones to start with. Like if there's a bad request, if the 401, if it's unauthorized, not log in, so that's authentication. Forbidden, again, still authentication. 404, not found. Request timeouts, the too many requests, and then you get into like these server side issues. Now you can get into more specifics as we did via ChatGPT, and your developer actually really might appreciate this. But I find that a lot of times you can kind of bucket them, like the error states, where like 5 or 6 different error states share the exact same design. Let's look at an example here. So an error 500, an internal server error. So something broke. A bad gateway. So a server acting as a gateway got an invalid response. The service is unavailable. The server did not get a response time. If a user got these specifically, would they care whether it's a 500, 502, 503, 504? Probably not, but the developer is going to care. So why do we need to tell the user specifically what these are and make the developers' lives more difficult by giving them 4 different error state designs that they're going to have to choose from? Okay, so that's a way that you can kind of approach it. Chat with your developers around what needs specific error states and what does not need specific error states, and which can be more like categorized and bucketed to share the exact same design. Okay. At the same time, so say if like a system's down, so maybe we're going to have one group where it's something like this. So sorry, I'm going to move these around. Again, this is how I audit these things. So maybe these ones are going to share a specific error state. So then what we see here, and again, version mismatch, we'll come back to that, is so bad requests. So then we have unauthorized and forbidden. Perfect. This is another error state. So you're logged in, but no permission. So you don't have access, or you're not logged in, or you're missing credentials. So maybe these could share a similar error state. Not found. 404 is a pretty common one that you always do kind of need, because you can kind of do some fun treatments with that, where it's like, oh, 404, like you're lost, but we're here for you. I don't know, something weird like that. Too many requests, rate limit throttling. Maybe 429 could also be categorized with this one as well, just be given it's pretty similar. So we have the request 404 not found. And then service outage can be categorized maybe with this as well. So again, these ones were more specific, general. Partial outage, yeah, maybe we'll touch upon this, but we'll include it in this group here. Off session, expired session. Maybe we'll actually touch upon this too, but we'll bring this down here. I think this is a unique one that we could also probably touch upon. Feature flags, rate limiting, version mismatch. I think that's fine. Okay, so let's go through and look at some of these, what the designs of these might look at, and talk about some of the use cases. Okay, so for these, I tend to look at them like the user can't really do anything. So what we're actually going to do is just get rid of that side navigation. Let's get rid of the items up here too. And then because I removed auto layout, I can just do that. And then what I tend to do is just like, I can even like take the alert banner as an example and just like detach some of these things. So what you can do is just play around with this a little bit. Sorry, we just tweak it. Set these to the middle. Also set this to the middle. Like it doesn't need to be like the most elaborate looking design. Okay. Where then maybe we set this to like our semi-bold. Oh, that's horrible. Maybe like an H5. And then we can blow this up something like 64 by 64. Okay. And then this can also be just like make that a little bit bigger. There we go. So something like this is horrible looking one, but I hope you get the point. is, for this, again, if you developers want the call out specifically in the UI, what to do. Sorry, this is really bugging me. So I'm going to set this like an H6. There we go, better. So if your developers want you to call out specifically what it is, like, oh, an internal server error, then you can do that. Okay. Also, too, what you can do is just be like something as simple as, we've run into an issue. Please refresh or contact support if you still need help. Something as simple as this, where contact support might be underlined because it's a link. And then let's add some gap here, something like 24. And then this here can just be a button that just says something like refresh. Okay, really that simple for some of these more system level ones. Okay, now one thing that is important to note is, let me just change this background here so this stands out a little bit more, is one thing that is also important to note, okay, is I know we have all these different groups here that we had before. So let me bring these down here. Is it could still be helpful, because chances are in like a user story that you're working with your developers, these might not all be rolled into one. You might have a user story for an error 500, a user story for a 502, a user story for a 503, a user story for a 504. So what you can do is really just copy it. Again, this is like, now we're getting into preferences for your development team, but it's use cases that I've worked with before. So like I'm going through it with you now too, where you can just copy it like 4 times or 5 times or however many times that you need to, bring down the annotation, okay, and then just copy it one for one, so they know exactly what it is that they're referring to. Because in the event something something small does change, like even if it's something like a wording, then they're going to know what's up. Okay, so then this is our 502. This here might be our 503. This here might be our 503. So I extend this out, and then this here might be our 504. Okay, so and then we have our 504. Okay, perfect. So there we have just some of our annotations for our system level alerts. We're just going to get rid of some of the other ones for now because we already covered this. Again, nice and easy. So next what we're going to do is we're going to look at sort of that auth session where the sessions is expired. So when it comes to this, usually like one way you can approach it, there's different ways you can approach it. So we're going to talk to your developers, take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. Is let me go back to actually your input annotations here. And let's bring in this page, okay? So let's say for the purpose of this exercise that when that session's expired, they go right into the login page. A developer is going to need to know that, okay? That's usually generally the treatment. It's very rare for like them to have a full page being like, hey, your session's expired, please log back in, and then be like retaken to the login page from there. Usually what happens when like a session's expired, again, you just go right to the sign up or login page, okay? So with that, call that out explicitly. Again, with the annotation. When session is expired, send the user to the login page so they know. Or else, you never know. If you give them this, they're going to build this as when it's just session's expired, which would be separate from the login page. They might just code this on their own. Unlikely, but you never know, right? Call it out explicitly. When the session's expired, send the user to the login page. One thing you might also want to do for something like this is if we go into, let me see if we have something up here, or just our alerts actually, our alerts inside of our kit. There we go. So you can bring in like an alert here, and if we hide, maybe just hide the icon, we hide the actions, and we hide the closable, and we set this to our, maybe like our error, and we can also hide the progress. You can also do like something at the side where if the session's expired, it sends them, session expired, please log back in. like one of these like alerts in the bottom right, snack bars, whatever you want to call it, sort of disappears after some time. Okay. Now, when that happens is you're going to need to add an annotation here. So now we're getting into some more finer things where you might need to add specific annotations. So you might have one annotation at the page level, but if there's something that pops up on the page, don't just assume that a developer is going to figure that out. Okay. Or see it or know. Yeah, sorry. Don't just assume that a developer is going to see it. Basically what I'm trying to get at here. So I don't know why I did that. Call that out explicitly as well. So when session is expired, also show the following snack bar component. Okay, so we're calling out what happens at a page level, but also any smaller interactions that are occurring, we're also calling that out as well. And I don't like that that's big. So maybe set this to something like 2. There we go. Keep things nice and clean. Okay, so there's an example for if the session is expired and the way that you can approach that kind of error state. Okay, so now let's look at authentication. So this is one that's kind of separate from like a login page that we can get to as well very shortly. But usually for authentication, where if a user enters like a link that's there, but they don't have authentication, it's usually just copy whatever error state we have up here for the similar format and be like, you don't have access. You don't have access. Please refresh your contact support if you still need help, like that kind of thing. 401s and 403, they can kind of just like share, like in my opinion, a similar error state. But sometimes for a 403, when they're not logged in or invalid credentials for a 401, you might actually just want to copy what you did for if a session was expired and just bring that down here. Okay, so then this could be that your 401 error. That's generally at least how I approach this kind of things. I've seen it done different ways before in the past too, but anyways, I digress. So then lastly, while we're here, a 404, again, super straightforward in the grand scheme of things. Let me just change this background here to again, and then a 404, I generally include it in its own section because developers tend to look for it sometimes more often than you would think, where, oops, this link does not exist. This link does not exist. And then just like a link to like return home. Okay. Return home, something like that. Okay. So really that simple and in the grand scheme of things. Now, so we have like our authentication, we have our 404, we have our session expired, we have our system level errors. So these are like some of the more common ones that you do tend to see. But again, when it comes to authentication, there's usually a lot of error states associated with this form itself. And let's look at some of those. So similar to how we did with like the other set. So basically I have just like that login page here and like, please give me, please, because I'm Canadian polite, please give me form field edge cases for my developers based on the screenshot and just see what it comes back with. Okay, so I don't like what it's coming back with. Okay, so let's look at more error state ish. Let's see what it comes back with. Okay, perfect. So the field level error states are more what I'm looking for. So if name is empty and they try to submit, need to empty their name. Too long, so must be 100 characters or fewer. Invalid characters like apostrophes, hyphens in the name. Okay, so we're getting into some rules there. Again, email can't be empty. A valid format for the email. Email domain isn't allowed. So I see this a lot with a lot of like sales websites where you can't enter like a Gmail or an Outlook. Account already used, that's a good one. Password, again, password's empty. Password too short. Password is weak. If you have a terms and conditions that they need to check. So these are all the types of rules that you would need in order for the developers to build out every possible scenario so that the user would be able to identify what's wrong with their submission. Okay, so you won't go through these like in depth. Let's just look at how I might set up one or two of these. Okay, so now let's look at how I would set this up. Now, the thing with like forms is there's usually, as you can see here, there's like 4 or 5 or sometimes even more different error states that it would happen. So this is where you can also start to, let me move my video bar out of the way, start to group these out also into their own sections, where this here might be email errors, name errors. So again, you're sort of introducing that other level of, oops, I have multiple sections here, so I don't know how that happened. Anyways, let's move this back up and move this down. There we go. Now we're cooking. Okay, sorry about that. Quick pivot, and we're back. Okay, but now, where's my name and email? There we go. So you can start to separate these out. So like name, and then we bring this down, and then you have email again, so that developers, they can always jump in and just based off the section, look for the error state that they're looking for. Okay. Now, but when it comes to actually setting these up, again, maybe we're just going to look at email as an example. Let me bring this down. Is usually within your design system, what you're going to have is some type of, let's look at an example here. So if I click into our email form here, so the way that we have this set up is, let's click in here. Maybe we'll go with our, we should have an error state here. Let's see what's going on. So we have our name, we have our email. So we have our hint copy. So it's within the hint copy. That's the way I had it set up. Sorry about that. So you usually have like some type of error copy associated with it. So if we turn on our hint copy, then we have our error copy there as well. But we can hide that hint copy for the name. So in this case, if enter a valid email, so let's say the user tries to submit, and then it's like name, and then there's a space, and then there's another space at like gmail.com. That error copy would be, enter a valid email as an example. Okay, so we can just get rid of that hint copy as well. So enter a valid email. Now, it's also important too that when we get to this form level here, use what I always like to do is I like to use like a bounding box and just sort of paste it inside and add a stroke, add a dash here. So custom, a dash, and then sort of set this to red and then like 3. So when the developer comes here, they know exactly what it is that they're looking at. So then I bring this out, and then invalid email format, and then again, just with an arrow, I link this down. So developer comes in here, they know exactly which error state is being referred to and what the format for that is. Okay, it's the small things, especially once you get into these larger like form fields or onboarding processes where there's a lot going on, where you need to be specific and actually calling these out. Okay, so next to every single one of the designs that I do is I always have this dev handoff checklist. And again, this checklist is actually free to download on our website. You do need to sign up for it, but it is free to download. You don't need to pay anything. My gift to you. So with that is, let's sort of go through what each of these stand for. Okay, so first is functional QA. With functional QA, it's basically just done that checking to see that you've done like your checks. You have padding and gap applied. Your elements are responsive. Things work as they're intended to work. That's really just functional QA. Next is if Token Studio is applied. This is a little bit less relevant now that Figma variables is kind of taken over, so the tokenization of Figma itself. But usually if you're using Token Studio, at least in the past, maybe they fixed it like since I last used it, is it would show on Figma that a variable is applied, but in Token Studio, it wasn't actually applied. So there was always a little bit of a disconnect. So I'd always have to go through and double check and make sure that Token Studio was actually applied, despite the fact that it's showing that the variable was applied. Also too, dark mode and light mode. If necessary, do they work as intended? Okay, are there any issues when you toggle into dark mode that you need to address? So basically, it's a final check to make sure that dark mode and light mode both work and look as they're intended to look. Usually this is done at more the variable level, but this sort of ties into the making sure that all your variables are applied, which gets into our design system tracker a little bit later. Also, too, layers named, that's pretty a basic one. You can do that with Figma now just by renaming layers. So if I was to select this frame here, come up, rename layers, it can rename all those layers for you. But again, it's super important to make sure that your layer names are consistent across a lot of your different sections. Property names consistent. This goes into your design system. So if you're not managing your design system, I wouldn't worry about that. I would leave that to them. Any documentation associated to the designs, and then also contrast checker as well, which ties closely into that dark mode and light mode. And usually you would only need to worry about it if like you're actually building out the components or you introduce something net new. Okay. But one thing I do want to introduce here is like the idea of like our design system tracker plugin and its purpose and how it helps with Dev Handoff. So I want to do a quick demo as to our design system tracker. Is we built this just to maintain like design system consistency, at least from like a variable level. And it really helps with Dev Handoff so that you don't have any rogue styles or rogue variables floating around, okay? So the scanning of the variables and the styles is free, but scanning of components, it is a paid feature. But anyways, if I was to scan sort of one section here, it usually doesn't work super well with like larger pages. So I can see there's no color styles. When I come to color variables, I can see that everything is attached to my design system. It's 100% remote, 0% local, and nothing's been unlinked. So when it comes to sort of looking to detect variables and styles, it's a great plugin that sort of helps you do that. Again, even with styles too, I can see that they're all remote, they're all attached, nothing is detached. And also too, for components, if you also detect the same components as well, what's remote, what's local, what's detached, but that is paid. And we're going to include that subscription as part of our one-time academy purchase in the future as well. Okay, so but again, colors, style variables, text styles, free. Color styles are here as well, even though they're not really used anymore. But it's a great plugin to use and a great free resource for you to use to make sure that all your variables are applied. There's no inconsistencies and nothing's been unlinked by accident before you hand off to your development team.
No, this is me just like talking off the cuff here, but one thing you never want to do when you're working with developers is just send them a prototype link. Okay, like what's a prototype link going to do for them? Especially once you get into more complex prototypes, where there's a bunch of different, almost like happy path flows that the user can go down. A developer is not going to know where to click, what to click, how to click. So like I see it all the time with junior designers, where when they're working with developers, they say, here's the prototype. Okay, but again, a developer might see only one happy path flow, but they might not click every interaction. So that's why it's super important, so that when you're working with your developers and you're actually at a state where you're sharing a prototype, you need to walk them through it. Now, I hate meetings like everyone else. I despise meetings. I try to keep my calendar as like clear as possible. But you got to walk through the prototype with your developers. And there's actually a tool that I use to do this. Okay. Now, this is not an ad at all. This is actually a tool I use probably every other day when I'm sending things to my developers, getting thoughts on their prototype, getting thoughts on their interaction. It helps because they can really see it in real life and start to visualize it instead of me just sending them a prototype link and hoping that they click the right thing. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you real quick to this tool called Screenstudio. Actually filming this inside Screenstudio. So as you can see here, it's perfect. It's just a real professional way to record product demos. You see like the bounding box around it. There's lots of customizable features as well that I'll review very shortly. But as you can see, like my mouse is pretty big on the screen. As you can see, I'm moving it around, which is great because then developers are going to know exactly what's being clicked. And I use this all of the time. Screenstudio, it is a little bit more on the expensive side. I did purchase like the $229 one-time payment just so I didn't need to worry about a subscription by any means, but I've gotten more than enough use out of this thing. Here's the Screenstudio UI. So it's basically just a real simple editor. To edit the actual like product demos for the developers. I have lots of great like features, like I can reduce the padding, I can hide the camera if I want to. Heck, if I'm sending this to a client, I can change the background as well. So when it comes to giving demos to your developers, would highly recommend this. You know, you can zoom in on specific elements. So if I'm working on, there's one element that I really want to highlight to a developer, I can use this to actually zoom in to whatever that element is. As you can see, I just easily added a zoom effect. So it just makes my life super easy and avoids all types of confusion when communicating features or functionalities to my development team. Okay, so one thing I want to do now is I want to briefly cover why it's so important to actually always build the mobile and tablet designs for your developers. Not everyone does it. And a big difference between junior designers and senior designers is senior designers just do it out the box, but junior designers generally need to be told, okay? Because there's always often the assumption that developers are going to know how elements should collapse down. Now, this isn't isn't meant to trash talk developers, but they don't look at things the way designers do, okay? And I want to look at this dashboard as an example. Sure, how these might condense down might be a little bit more straightforward. The alert would stay at the top. These cards would stack. The table, of course, would still be below. The table would have a scrolling function likely. Again, that's kind of table stake stuff. A lot of developers are going to be familiar with what that's like. Now, but what if we look at the sidebar here? What's that going to look like on mobile? I don't know. Do you know? Would a developer know? Chances are that a developer might look at this and might just leave it out entirely. They might introduce a certain type of navigation, maybe like a tabbed scroll, but maybe you actually want a slide out menu. So this is a quick example, but it's a good one as to why to never leave mobile, what designs look like, what your design should look like on different device sizes, whether tablet or mobile, to chance. Okay, because even the smaller elements can really confuse developers and can lead to an experience that wasn't the one that you had actually envisioned. So I promise you, please set aside a day, set aside an afternoon to actually go through, build out those mobile responsive designs. And chances are within your design system too, there are already mobile designs for a lot of these components. Okay. So work with your senior designer, work with your design systems lead to identify what are the mobile components for some of these web components that have a little bit more of a tricky scale down to different device sizes. So I've worked with a ton of clients and designers and design systems in my day. Okay. I know I'm only 28. I'm still young, but the experience is there where I've seen a ton of cases where Fortune 500 companies, they'll have a web design system and then they'll have a mobile design system. And I'm like, what's the point? Why do you have that? I've seen cases where in that mobile design system, there's a 2-pixel gap or 2-pixel difference in height between their desktop components and their mobile components. Does that really impact a user that much? Having a 2-pixel less height between device sizes? What's the point of that? There really isn't. So long story short, if you're working with components, don't force a mobile component if you don't need it. These buttons as an example. Would these work on mobile? Absolutely. So why do you need a mobile button? Just use your desktop buttons on mobile. You don't really need to overcomplicate things all that much. Again, that's going to confuse developers too, because they're going to be saying, oh, is this for mobile? It's for desktop. Having to swap the components just creates an overall mess. Okay. But that said, there's some edge cases where mobile components actually do come in handy. And for that, look at something like a header, which is kind of just like a navigation, which is just what we looked at, right? How is this going to condense down on mobile? It's not easy for a developer to understand. In this navigation would absolutely not work on mobile, right? Because it's wide, it's not tall. Mobile wants tall, not wide. So go through your design system and only build out mobile components for the ones that don't condense down nicely. Okay, you don't need a mobile button at the end of the day. You don't need a mobile input, but you are going to need a mobile navigation, because just as we viewed how that condenses and what that sidebar would look like, you don't want to leave that up for chance for your developers to try to figure out on your own. Lay it out for them. It's super easy. So long story short, go through your design system with your design system lead, senior designers. If you run a design system, go through it yourself and just take stock of all the different components that you have and see, okay, which ones don't condense down nicely? Which ones absolutely have no purpose being on mobile, where we actually need specific mobile layouts? Chances are there's only going to be maybe 5 components at max. Maybe with layouts and sections a little bit differently, but don't overcomplicate things. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate your support. If you want to watch a video, I highly recommend to click right there. If you want to watch our Build a Design System series, click right there. And again, be sure to check out our academy below. Again, we really want to build the future of design education in a way that's affordable for everyone, and your support really, really goes a really long way. So again, I'll put a link for that down below. See you at the next one.